Okay, so welcome once more, everyone, for to eighth lecture in the SOAS World Philosophies lecture series. As you know, the SOAS World Philosophies lecture series is organized by the World Philosophies team at SOAS University of London, and we started running this January last year. Some of you have been part of the journey, and we've enjoyed quite a number of interesting lectures and conversations around world philosophies, around epistemic injustice, epistemic colonization, personhood, and so on. But this year, we've started focusing on lectures or discourses on specific philosophical traditions. So for some of you who were here in February, we looked a bit at Mexican philosophy. We had Professor Sanchez talk about existentialism. And today we'll be looking at a very interesting and important aspect of Chinese philosophy. So you're all welcome to this lecture. And I thank Dr. Andrew Hines, who is one of the core teaching members of the World Philosophies program, for joining as well. We have other core members who can't make it at the moment. Dr. Sean Hawthorne, who is the head for World Philosophies, and Dr. Bjorn Fretter, who I'm not sure if he's here now yet, but might be able to join us later. So today we have the pleasure and the honor to hear the lecture delivered by Professor Ronnie Littlejohn. Ronnie Littlejohn is the Cheney Distinguished Professor of Philosophy and Director of Asian Studies at Belmont University. Littlejohn is widely published in Chinese philosophical tradition. His works include the very recent and fascinating book, which I use for some of my modules, Chinese Philosophy and Philosophers, published by Bloomsbury in this year, 2022. Other of his works include Introduction to Confucianism, published by the Foreign Language Teaching and Research Press in China in 2020. The Historical Dictionary of Daoism, published by Roman and Littlefield in 2019, Daoism and Introduction, published in 2009, and he's also co-editor of Riding the Wind with Lazy, New Perspectives on the Daoist Classic, published by Sony Press in 2011. He's a recipient of the Foreign Scholar Award from the Henan Province Ministry of Education, and he was one of the only 3 foreign scholars asked to speak at the dedication of the Laozi and Daoist Culture Center in Louis County in 2009. So we have before us someone who is an expert in the field and who is widely published in Chinese philosophy. And so it's really a privilege and an honor to introduce him and to listen to his lecture today. So we'll have him speak for maybe 40, 45 minutes thereabout, and then we'll have enough time for questions and comments. As I said earlier, feel free to drop your comment or question on the chat as the lecture goes on, and we'll attend to it after the lecture. Professor Littlejohn, you have our attention.
Thank you so much, Elvis, and let me express my appreciation to you and to Andrew, to everyone at the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. It's a great honor for me to be here today. And we have many experts in Chinese philosophy who are here. I see so many names appearing from whom I have learned a great deal. Nice to see PJ, Ivanhoe here, and David Chai, and my good friend Karen Lai, from whom I've learned a lot. And so many of you, I could take a few minutes and name every one of you, and it would take me all of my time and then some to comment on the things that I've learned from you. So I hope that we will have some stimulating conversation, and I'm sure we will not all agree, but we will all learn from each other. And I'm very appreciative of your attendance today. Thank you so very much. So I'm going to share screen, and as Elvis has suggested, I've prepared a PowerPoint to walk through. So a few of the slides may seem to you to be a little busy with text, and I apologize in advance on that, but I'll try not to read to you. But I did want to follow the directions of Elvis rather than just read a paper. So give me a second. So our topic today is contemplative transformation in early Daoism. We're going to be talking about figures who could be called perfected persons with the Chinese Zhenren, or superlative persons with the concept Zhiren throughout our conversation today. And so I laid out a kind of plan for us, and just to keep myself organized and hopefully to let you know where we're going and how we're moving through things. I'm going to, first of all, mention just a few individuals. We'll look at a few texts, and I think without exception, all of these are taken from Zhuangzi, because the corpus of Daoist lore and text on perfected persons is very extensive. It would even include, for example, Ge Hong's fabulous work, as well on immortals or transcendence, as our friend Rob Campany calls them. So I'm just going to refresh our mind on who these people are we're talking about, who have been changed by contemplative practice. Then secondly, I just want to look at the actual regimen used, and we will reconstruct that from various texts. And also we'll look at the very famous and seminal essay, Zuowang, setting and forgetting, or setting in oblivion, as Livia Kahn translates it. And then lastly, and maybe our main focus will be on just what it is that I think happens in the practice of Daoist contemplation. And here I'll enter into conversation probably most directly with Harold Roth, and his essay on bimodal consciousness. So that's more or less the plan that I've set out for us. And again, by Elvis's suggestion, we'll maybe go through and save our questions till the end. And so please jot down questions or comments that you'd like to make. I know I am very interested in hearing your comments as well. So who were these persons? In the Tao Te Ching, there's just one snapshot of these individuals where they are characterized in pretty much, I would say, poetic sorts of descriptions. But I think by just looking at this, you can see how remarkable the individuals were regarded and how distinctive they were regarded. And whoever was a transmitter of this particular logion into the Tao Te Ching makes use of all sorts of Taoist imagery. For example, that these individuals are receptive as a valley. This is an image that shows up a great deal in the Tao Te Ching. In P.J. Ivanhoe's translation, he also makes uh, a very significant point about the role of the valley and the role of the feminine, which is receptivity. It's shapeable as a block of wood. And of course, those of us who are students of Daoism know that here they're talking about not a manufactured block of wood, an uncarved block of wood that then becomes shapeable by their contemplative practice. This is one snapshot, and you can take a minute to read this through. It's probably one of the most famous passages in Zhuangzi, talking about the perfected persons, here called spirit persons or spirit men, Shenren, who abide in the mountains of Gusher. Now, so actually, we will see along the way that contemplative practice in Daoism up till maybe the 2nd century of the Common Era was very often related to caves and mountain dwellings. And Thomas Michael, myself, and others have pointed out many times the significance of caves in Daoist, in early Daoist practice, especially in the cultivation of contemplation. And if we have time, I'll try to comment along the way on why I think that this fact is quite significant, not just in China, but across India, especially northern India, and into Europe, into the Mediterranean area. And we would find the pre-Socratics engaging in contemplative practice in cave dwellings as well, partly because caves played such a significant physical or spatial role in being able to follow the regimen to enter contemplative states. There are many, as you know, created dialogues, invented dialogues in the Zhuangzi, where Confucius is the main actor and is often made to speak as a Daoist. And this is one of those from the 6th chapter. And here he is responding to a question from Zikong, one of his most prominent disciples, in which he is trying to describe these individuals, the Genren, and how they look so different. And permit me, maybe I will read a little bit of this. Such men as they, said Confucius, wander beyond the realm. Men like me wander within it. Beyond and within can never meet. It was stupid of me to send you to offer condolences. Even now, they have joined with the Creator and wander as men in the single breath of heaven and earth. Idly they roam beyond the dust and dirt. They wander free and easy in the service of wuwei. So again, just getting our feel for how these individuals might have appeared in a normal community or ordinary community. If you've been teaching Daoism, you know that one question that you often get from contemporary students is, well, how could you be a Daoist and still exist in a contemporary community? And I think that's a real question, and one that should be taken with seriousness. The practices that eventuated in perfected persons were transmitted along lineages. The Zhuangzi has several narratives in which it makes clear that there are long lineage, student and disciple, disciple and master lineages, which carry along not just teachings, but carry along instructions and practice. This is just one of them, but I think it's probably the most detailed in some sort of attempt to respond to a question about where one gains the knowledge of contemplative practice. In this particular response is given, of course, by a very famous female Daoist master. And the last one of these here, maybe toward the end here, ordinary men strain and struggle against life. The sage appears to them to be ignorant and blockish, but he takes part in 10,000 ages and achieves simplicity and oneness. For him, all the 10,000 things are just what they are, and thus they enfold each other. So that's a little survey, a very brief survey of what kinds of individuals I want to talk about. And I want to point to some of the central features of the Daoist practices that eventuated in these individuals acting and living as they did. Even though I've called attention right now to the Zhuangzi primarily, and maybe one passage from the Lao Tzu, the Tao Te Ching, you can see that we could trace records of and allusions to the practices that eventuated in perfected persons throughout many texts, and these texts span a large period of time. The Huainanzi, for example, would be about 2nd century BCE. The Taiping Jing would be maybe 1st to 2nd century of the Common Era. Then we have the Shanger commentary on the Lao Tzu, in which the practices of particularly stillness, quietude are very important. We even have instructions from the community that produced that particular commentary, instructions on how to create a quiet room. By the time that commentary was written, let's say 2nd century of the Common Era, by that time, it was not convenient. If you were trying to follow the Daoist way or the Daoist practice, trying to cultivate oneself by contemplation, it wasn't convenient to go to the mountains and live in the caves. So it was necessary for the various new communities of Daoists to create instead quiet rooms, and every house, every Daoist family was supposed to have one. We find the same sort of instructions, set of formulas for contemplative practice in the Baozi and in the text, all the way down to Wang Changyang's instructions on transformation, which would take us into the 12th century. So you can see a long history. And you'll notice on the right that the newly published work that came out in 2022 of Harold Roth, which is actually a collection of earlier essays written by Professor Roth, in which he will detail not only the sort of regimen of contemplative practices, but we will reconstruct them from all of these texts, actually. So this is what the reconstruction will look like. We find in these texts a recurring family of concepts, each concept pointing to a particular kind of practice. The practice of stillness, the practice of silence or quietude, the practice of making the mind empty, void, also associated with what's called fasting the mind. The practice of opening oneself in receptivity, borrowing particularly the metaphor of the feminine being receptive, not only because it is yin rather than yang, but because, for example, in sexuality, the feminine is receptive. And then, of course, the general term that is used sort of as a classification for the entire contemplative practice, the notion of so one, setting in forgetfulness. So you can see then why caves were so closely associated with contemplative practice in early Daoism, especially the earliest forms of Daoism that we find ensconced in the Lao Tzu, in Zhuangzi, in the Guanzi, and also even in the Huainanzi, because you know, a cave is an area separated from the external. It's filled with stillness, silence, quietude. The further you go in it, the more void it becomes. So it is actually a space that makes possible the suspension of a sense of body and a sense of sense perception, which belong to the notion of shu, or emptiness. One is not just emptying oneself of discriminations like success and failure, or virtue concepts like courage or honesty, or benevolence or appropriateness, as the Confucians would have it. It's one's not just emptying oneself of concepts of the mind, linguistically instantiated or rationally instantiated, but also of sense perception itself, of awareness of body. And of course, many studies have been done about just how radically space, time, and so forth are affected by being in a cave. And I'm sure almost everyone's walked through a cave on some tour group when they've turned off the lights. But that's just a momentary blink of the eye. It takes about 15 minutes for a sense of disorientation to occur. And I'm suggesting that this was certainly a part of contemplative practice, as it was known in early Daoism. The essay on setting in forgetfulness was written during the Tang period, and it's definitely the most important essay in terms of gathering together. Sima Changjian, who wrote the essay, collected material from the text that I've been talking about and that we've already sort of hinted at and pointed to. He watched carefully the recurrence of the concepts that I've tried to identify, and then he brought them together into basically a pattern of practice, which could be transmitted along master-disciple lineages. And he's got 7 steps here, and these you can see. And I hope maybe you'll have some questions about those a bit later on. Olivia Cohn has done a fine translation of that work into English. So just looking quickly at the components of this practice, stillness being one of them, there's an idiom in Daoism, in early Daoism, that we see specifically in the Zhuangzi, according to which a master is said to be able to make his body or her body, the body, as an old dead tree and appear in such a far off state of mind that the mind is like dead ashes. Now, when you read this, I don't know about you, but this doesn't necessarily sound that appealing to me. But I think they're trying to capture what it is for one to look on someone in a state of contemplative practice, for a third party to look at this individual. And all 5 of those instances or passages from Zhuangzi are recorded by an external observer, maybe looking at Lao Tzu or some other figure and describing their appearance in this way. It's not unlike what we would find in the Presocratic in terms of descriptions of Parmenides, Epimenides, practicing what in Greek is called incubation. And so again, in that practice, done also in a dark place, a cave, the practitioner is completely still and completely quiet. I dare say that the most famous of the exchanges or dialogues between Confucius and anyone else in the Zhuangzi is Confucius's dialogue with Yan Wei, where Yan Wei talks about that he feels he is getting there because he can set in forgetfulness, excuse me. I'm trying to drink a cup of coffee and that's got caught in my throat. So I think it's interesting to pay attention to Yan Wei's last response to Confucius. What do you mean set in forgetfulness? I let loose the conscious connection to my limbs and my physical structure falls away. I do away with sense perception and set aside what I thought I knew, and I can become identical with the great thoroughfare. This is what I mean by sitting in forgetfulness. So notice that, again, there's a real disconnection between body, sense perception, and what one thinks one knows that go on in this emptying and forgetting. Here, Confucius is doing the instruction. In the previous slide, Confucius was the student, Yan Wei the teacher. In this slide, Yan Wei is back to his traditional role of being a student and Confucius playing the role of teacher. Okay, so I think perhaps we will not stop right now and go further into slides about cave experiences and contemplative practice, because I'm anxious to move on to a discussion of what happens. What is it that actually happens in the practice of Daoist contemplation? So in Roth's essay, in which he's trying to address this question of what actually goes on in contemplative practice in early Daoism, he titles the essay Bimodal Mystical Experience in the Chiwulan, which is the second chapter of Zhuangzi. So these terms in his title are very important. Bimodal means two types of consciousness going on. And the fact that Roth definitely uses the concept of the mystical, of mysticism. He doesn't speak of mindfulness. He's speaking in and relying on work originally done by individuals such as Walter Stace and also even William James on mystical experiences and what they are like. And he is saying that in the contemplative, and this is an interpretation, in the contemplative experience of early Daoist, they experience something both internal, introvertive, and something extrovertive. And he employs the old analytical distinctions in epistemology between knowing that and knowing how. So that Roth argues that in this contemplative mystical experience, there is first an entering a state of consciousness in which one gains knowledge. There is cognitive gain. This gain may not be in language. You know, sometimes when we think of thoughts or what it is we know, we're thinking in terms of a sentence. We're basically talking to ourselves when we're having a thought. And Roth is not asserting that this kind of knowledge, mystical knowledge, is something that occurs in language. In fact, of course, we know that Daoist texts often speak of the wordless teaching. And Roth makes the connection between the introvertive, cognitive, mystical gain that occurs and our normal form of expressing knowledge or thinking about knowledge claims or things we know. This is followed by a return to a re-engagement with the world, a kind of extrovertive consciousness where the mind is re-engaged, the body is re-engaged in its daily routine, but it's armed with this mystical knowledge. And here, Roth is using mystical to distinguish it from knowledge that comes by sense or by reflection or by rationality. So if you're talking about sources of knowledge, you know, we would talk about senses and reason, perhaps logic, and so forth. But he's multiplying these sources to include the mystical state of contemplative practice. And by means of this knowledge, this gain of something one knows, then one has a know-how. One can act in spontaneous, effortless action, for which we can use the Daoist concept of wuwei. So please permit me to read this quote. After the experience of merging with the way, one has discovered the axis at the center of the circle within. And so when one carries this experience back into everyday life and naturally maintains a connection to the way, one can always respond spontaneously and harmoniously to whatever the situation demands, to whatever set of it, other, or that's it, that's not categories are found in the limited Weisher viewpoints, that is external viewpoints of the world, of those with whom one is interacting. So as Ross says, we might best describe the extrovertive life that is enabled, empowered, instructed by the introverted mystical experience as a Tao-centered mode of being. Where Tao replaces ego or self. Now, I have some difficulties with this interpretation. I think embedded in this argument are some very significant philosophical traps. And one of them is the emphasis that is being placed on mystical knowledge as another kind of knowledge or another type of knowledge, which then sort of inserts itself between the practitioner and her movement. Some sort of knowledge content has to be specified or given. And maybe the Daoist texts do speak of, wordless teaching, but this, to me, as a philosopher, this continues to exacerbate the problem of just what knowledge is gained here. And if you think about the very intense and extensive ways in which even the text Zhuangzi criticizes thinking that the solution to the human predicament, the human puzzling, the human tying of ourselves in knots, even thinking that knowledge is the solution to this. In chapter 2, for example, or parables like the parable of the Yellow Emperor and his Black Pearl. These are all meant to criticize the idea that knowledge is a solution to the predicament of the human being. I think there's another problem with the bimodal reading, and it is that it's continuing to preserve what we might identify as a very Western way of thinking about, let's say, morality, where we might think of rational morality. We might conceive of the entire moral enterprise as constructions of dilemmas and solutions of dilemmas and figuring out excusing conditions and matters such as this. Or we might think of care ethics and sentiment and so forth. And here I'm thinking of Michael Sloat's work on moral sentimentalism, but if his recent work and so forth. But if you think of Sloat's work here, you have to acknowledge really that he's still conceiving of a sort of rationalist, sentimentalist split. And I think my argument is such a split like this never addresses the problem of the will. What it is we know or what it is we feel, we must still think about how to will it, how to do it, how to move our volition. So my argument is that what takes place in Daoist contemplation is that the practitioner doesn't come to know something, but the practitioner herself, himself, is actually changed, altered, and altered not by knowledge, some sort of knowledge gain, but altered by the practice in which they're engaging. This practice which produces a kind of alternative consciousness, which is really another way of talking about transformation. Daoists do say that a person is remade. We could pick any number of 30 or 40, I think, examples of the analogs that Daoist texts make between the practitioner or the genran, perfected person, and one who has become newborn, who has become like an infant. So the point of Daoist contemplative practice, I think, is not what it leads to in terms of it leading to some sort of gain of cognitive knowledge, even some sort of quote unquote special knowledge like mystical knowledge, but rather what the experience consists in. And that is the actual transformation of a person. So the practitioner then doesn't rely on something that she knows from a mystical experience, but rather something she's become. So I think that this is what Daoism offers. Daoism, I wouldn't classify really as a soteriological tradition, but maybe it's more like a therapeutic tradition. But it's a very robust one, one meant to solve and break the hold of the will, or the tension between knowing and willing, or feeling, having sentiments and willing. And it's meant to break this hold by the transformation of the practitioner himself. Now, this also suggests something maybe even somewhat more controversial, and that is how the concept of Tao is being used here. Oneness with Tao, unity with Tao. I'm suggesting that these expressions are not meant to point to a nominative, the Tao. Not even a unification with it, not even a oneness with some sort of force that moves or inclines us, but rather oneness with Tao as a way of talking about the new being that has been made possible by contemplative practice. So just as Sema Changjen would have it in his 7th step, one achieves Tao. So Tao is not something to believe in, have a relationship with. It's not even something to use. It's something to become. And maybe understood in this way, again, we can see a closeness between maybe the notion of Genren in early Daoist contemplative practice and the Greeks' daimon. So Daoists, I think, are pointing to something very significant in their constructions and their practice of contemplation as they understand it. And that is an apotheosis of the human being. And this, I think maybe we should take the analogy of new birth rather seriously here. And I conclude with this. Wang Chongyong was the founder of the complete perfection lineage of Daoism, Chuanjian, still the major lineage of Daoism active in China today. He describes his experience of contemplation as, he speaks of himself as a now living dead man. So there's some sense in which he dies and is reborn in in this experience. And in his case, this experience found expression in his poems and his poetry. And I hope by now you had a chance to just read through this one poem, because I think that it is an attempt to express how he feels himself recreated. So I want to thank you so very much for your attention, and look forward to your comments and questions along the way. So Elvis, thank you for allowing me that time. Maybe I'm over a few minutes.
Thank you so much, Ronnie. That was packed with a lot of information that cuts across a lot of theoretical issues in philosophy, epistemology, philosophy of mind, consciousness, and before I could digest a bit, you started another. So I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions, comments. Some may come perhaps after this hour, so to your email or something. Yeah, but thank you so much for that. I was particularly interested in the idea that of how contemplative practice is not a route to knowledge, but some sort of altered being or a changed being, to the extent that it leads to it sort of bridges this bimodality or binaries of knowing and willing, sentiments and rationalism, and so on. And that's something I really like to hear a bit more about. Perhaps, but I would now ask for anyone who would want to ask a question or comment, anything. You can put it on the chat, you can raise your hand and we'll call on you to ask. So let's begin with Andrew, please.
Thank you so much, Professor Littlejohn. I learned quite a lot. That was very informative. So it was a huge pleasure to listen to. I was really, one of the things that I think with my first years here at SOAS quite a lot about is the way in which philosophical ideas are shaped by the context within which they're written. And I was really struck by the section when you were talking about the concepts of stillness, not just being about stillness in this massively abstract sense, but through the practice. And I wondered if you could say a bit more about that. Like, I know myself living in London here, it's massively gray, but when I go to Greece, I'm suddenly like, oh, this is what Plato was talking about with the sun, and I wonder how the experience of the cave would shape, and I mean the cave in your research, and how that experience would shape these concepts. Could you talk a bit more about that?
I think in the earliest forms of what we might call Daoist practice, there are no texts, right? So individuals are participating in behaviors, and for whatever reason, they're living in caves. This is just, I think, anthropologically correct, because caves are shelters. They can be secured, this sort of thing. And from my own point of view, by living in these, they began to have certain sorts of experiences, such as I've described. And sometimes, if you do have a sense where your sense perception is really radically altered, you do get still. And then you can replicate the experience by following something that maybe originally wasn't followed by intention. And so then that's how it becomes a practice, and that's how it becomes part of a regimen, I think. And these, I think, predate the text. And the texts follow as various kinds of expressions or attempts to express what what's experienced. There's a book that's been influential on me by Ustinova, a Russian scholar, who is called The Caves in the Greek Mind, and where she's primarily addressing the role of that form of living on pre-Socratic philosophers such as Pythagoras and Parmenides and Epimenides, and trying to highlight the fact that we might think of, for example, Pythagoras, we may think of as a logician and a mathematician, but actually Pythagoras was a priest, and and now we know that he lived underneath his school in a set of caverns, and he trained his students there. And the form of initiation by incubation was a very important entry into his school and such. So I think we're noticing a phenomena that is transcultural, dating back to the 4th, 5th, maybe even 6th centuries BCE.
Thank you, Ronnie. We have Ruth Schumann. Did I pronounce that right? And then after which we'll have Blake Simmons.
Thank you, Elvis. Thank you, Ronnie. I think it's very good to pay attention to Daoism. What I noticed in your talk is that you're saying there would be a perfected being, a perfected person even. So you seem to suggest that the transformation is of an imperfect person to a perfect person. And I think this is a typical Western thinking, because it seems from Taoist text directly that it's a transformation from believing yourself to be a person who has consciousness to realize that you are consciousness and having a human experience. So you're not a person having a conscious experience, you are consciousness having a human experience. And once you realize that you are consciousness and that the human being is something that appears to you, then this human being, you see that this is part and parcel of what appears, part and parcel of the world. And that person naturally acts, cannot but do what it must do, what it will dictates it to do. So this is wuwei. This is, the person does nothing in the sense that it intentionally does anything. This intention is coming from somewhere, we don't know where, and this person must do that. So he does nothing, and yet he leaves nothing undone because the things are happening. And I think the greatest practice to make this switch from identification with the human being to identification with consciousness are the practices you described. The cave as the sense deprivation room of en la lettre, but especially also the butterfly parable, which is so famous. This Changchu dreaming that he was a butterfly and then waking up and not knowing if he was Changchu or if he was a butterfly. And what is the answer? Neither. He was neither Changchu. He was also not the butterfly. He was the one that was aware of having been a butterfly in the dream and being Changchu in the waking life dream, let's say. So this points directly at consciousness. And then Changchu says, this is the great transformation. Could you see something in that?
Thank you so much for your comments. I wouldn't drive too heavy a truck over this word perfected, because the Chinese is Zhenren, and Zhen can be just complete or actualized, or often is translated as true person. So I don't mean perfection in this, let's say in the Greek sense or Western sense of perfection, like moral perfection, something like that. And I do quite agree with you, though I didn't get into the question of consciousness itself. I don't think the Daoist texts are suggesting that, but I'm not sure about this, but I don't think they're suggesting that we have a conscious or consciousness like something. And I think that's your main point, or one of your main points was that, we don't have a mind, we don't have a consciousness and this sort of thing as an object and at all. And so when I'm talking about contemplative practice, being a way to become another person or for a transformation of the person, I mean transformation of consciousness, okay, here. And but we would, I think you and I would have a great time talking together about Wittgenstein's notion of consciousness and person, and use of personal pronouns, the I, and so forth. So thank you so much for your comments, though.
Yeah, that was very interesting angle to discuss from. Thank you, Ruth. Blake?
Hello, Dr. Littlejohn.
Hi, Blake, how are you? Good to see you.
I'm living the dream.
Are you in Shanghai?
For a week. I've got a flight back to Nashville May 6th, so maybe we should get some coffee when I get back. But I found your presentation really relevant to me because I'm currently writing about the notion of goodness in Daoism for my thesis. And I guess this is slightly connected to the previous question from, and I'm so sorry if I butchered your name, but Ruth Schurman. And so I'm not too familiar with or not as familiar as I should be with the Zhuangzi, but in the Tao Te Ching, we hear that the way, the Tao, takes its model from what is self-so, from what is Zeren. And so I was just wondering if there was a connection between the Junren, like the perfected person, just being what is self-so, or if there's maybe those two things don't directly match up.
Oh, I don't know. I think they do match up. I think the perfected person altered by the practice, contemplative practice I've tried to describe in general terms. This person then wuweis, he acts as Rudd suggested in wuwei, moves in wuwei, and this is a kind of self-sowing. Yeah, I think what I would caution us as we think about this, the one caution I would raise is not to think that there is some emulation of the good, or even the Tao as the good, or following the Tao as good. I think those would be dead ends for us that might take us down the road of what Rudd is cautioning us about, importing Western readings onto the text or onto the Tao and so forth. So I'd be cautious about that.
Okay, thank you so much, and hopefully see you soon.
Definitely.
Elvis, I think you're muted.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't know that. Thank you, Blake. So now we'll have Philip, and then we'll have Helen.
Thank you. So Ronnie, as always, it's edifying to hear you talk about these things. And I had just two.
Good to see you, my friend. Good to see you, my friend.
I had two just kind of comments that I'd like you to then comment on. One is about the cave metaphor or caves, and then the other is about your claim about knowledge. And these are just things really kind of suggestions that I'd like to hear you talk more about, because especially on the cave, you talk about it being a good symbol for the quiet and that it conveys the ideas of quiet and silenceness. But it also, as you were talking, it made me think it's also a symbol of things like the female, emptiness, the inner, that it transcends the everyday in the sense of cuts off our contact with other kinds of the normal sensory world. And then it also made me think, gee, it seems like it's almost the antithesis of the use of the cave in Greek thought. So even though they're both using caves, you know, I think metaphors often don't carry all of their meaning until they're contextualized. But I mean, for Plato, the whole idea is to get out of the cave, right, and get to the light. Whereas, you know, so I just thought it's a really, really interesting observation about, and I never really thought of caves in terms of their philosophical symbolism and meaning. But so that's just my first comment, and I invite you to say something. The other thing's really short, and that is, I think you're absolutely right about knowledge. The role of, you know, the idea that somehow a special knowledge is sought for. I think if you go down that route, you end up in the problem that Professor Sherman was talking about, and that if you're conscious of something, then you're still in a duality with something and separated from the world, and you can't get into wuwei and all these things. And I was thinking a good, you know, an example of it for me are things like, you know, say you're agoraphobic, right? And that's a not natural state to not want to get outside, right? So you want to get back to, again, a kind of Daoist, back to return to a normal, healthy, spontaneous state. Well, you don't sit there and study psychology in order to overcome agoraphobia. You may understand the nature of your problem and some of the sources of your problem, and you can have that special knowledge, but you're still afraid to go outside. And what you really need is to undergo a process of therapy where you're no longer thinking about how freaked out you are about going outside. Or you don't need the theory of psychology because if you're a healthy person, if you're a Genrin, you're just going to go about your business unself-consciously. You know. So anyhow, those are my two comments on caves and on knowledge. Thanks again.
As always, great thoughts, my friend. So I agree with you totally that Plato's use of the cave is very different than we find in the Presocratics. And in studying Greek philosophy, we would know why, right? Because Plato is trying to set himself off over against a good deal of the pre-Socratic tradition. Just look at the essay on Parmenides, for example. And if you think about that essay, its subject, its portrayal of Parmenides and so forth, it completely completely erases Parmenides' role as a priest himself, for whatever experiences he was having in caves. These are really not included, except that Plato wants to use the cave as a foil for all you see in the cave with shadows. You've got to, you know, go out and see the good and truth. For your second comment, I really want to latch on this idea of therapy. I suppose that my own reading of Daoism has really changed in the last 10 years. And I have come to understand, think of it primarily as a sort of therapy. And not in a sense of technical sense of psychology. I think your caution there is really, really important. But it is meant to sort of help us overcome a kind of problem, and it may be a problem of our own making. I think Daoists definitely think that we create our own problems. We're the ones that puzzle our lives. We're the ones that trouble our lives. You know, it's like the person afraid to go outside is troubling himself, as it were. And so they're offering us a way that's not appealing to cognitive knowledge, lines of argument, and so forth, but something that you do. The practice itself is something you do, even if that practice is quietude and stillness. That is something you do, and this is meant, I think, to be the therapy itself. So I didn't do a very good job on your excellent comments, PJ, but thank you for sharing.
Yeah, interesting contrast with the Platonic conception of cave and the Daoist or Presocratic conception. That's something really worth exploring. Thank you, Philip, and thank you, Ronnie, for that. Helen?
Hi, thank you so much. And thanks to the SOAS people for this absolutely fabulous series. I'm a counseling philosopher. I have been doing philosophical counseling for about 20 years. I'm in Cape Town, and I've always had kind of a Daoist flavor to it, although it's been reading on my own, and I'm certainly not as skilled in as the people who are talking here, but I'm so glad to hear you talking about therapy. And the question, I'm so looking forward to the recording, because I can follow up on all of these things that you've brought me, huge gifts. But to add just one other aspect is, I'm wondering about the relational, if there were relational practices, if there were friendship practices between students other than, and the teacher-student role. How were these people relating with each other in these practices? Thanks.
The whole time I was preparing this talk, Helen, and I've been working with Hal Ross on this for several years, I've wondered the same sort of thing, because it looks like a very isolated form of practice, where, consider this, you're moving out of the world of community, away from other people, and you're getting progressively more isolated. You're moving into a cave. You're eventually moving into darkness and utter stillness. You're not interacting with your world in terms of sense perception. I mean, there's that passage from Zhuangzi where, you know, Zhuangzi is talking about sort of smashing his body, getting rid of the body feelings and the sense perceptions, that the hearing, the touching, the tasting, so forth. And these seem to be moving you more and more toward a kind of isolation. But we do know that the master-disciple lineages were strong, and they're very well documented all the way back to the 4th century in the Zhuangzi. Students are being sent by masters to other masters to study. Oh, I can't really, I've taken you as far as I can with that. I'm going to send you over here. And there's one whole chapter of Zhuangzi, the Nanrong Chu chapter is all concerned with such an individual who's being moved around, gun sang chu, and so forth. So I feel a little bit at a loss responding to this because and I can be corrected. Please correct me if I'm wrong, especially people like David, Chai, and so forth, who really know the terrain very well here. But I just feel sometimes that we don't have strong Daoist communities until about the 2nd century CE. And if that's right, then you've got a period of about 400 years where you have largely an individualistic kind of tradition, or very small groups of master disciple lineages and small communities that might arise. That looks like it's triggering you to a thought, Helen. Please don't be shy.
Thank you, Helen. Ryan?
Yes. Hi, Dr. Littlejohn. Good to see
Hey,
you.
Ryan, how are you? How are things at Harvard?
Going very well. Thanks. I just passed my exam, so happy.
Oh, congratulations.
I was really struck. First of all, I appreciate picking up on a number of things people have said about your point about Daoist practice is therapeutic, and you kind of contrast that with soteriological. Kind of continuing that strand, I'm really interested in the language of death that you were picking up on, particularly as it relates to kind of returning to the state of infancy or something like that through contemplative practice. I'm wondering though, considering other elements of Daoist practice and concerns, particularly with the kind of achievement or realization of immortality or longevity, if we might see those both at work, both therapeutic and soteriological, or maybe, considering the diversity of the tradition, if it just depends on who you're talking about and whether they are, maybe being more therapeutic or soteriological or both. But anyway, so the language of death in particular struck me, and I wonder if you could say more on that.
Thank you very much. Great questions. So when I'm saying that when I'm choosing therapeutic rather than soteriological to describe Daoism, I guess by soteriological, I mean the dependence on something external to save one, redeem one, to transform one, whether that is in a kind of Abrahamic religious tradition sense, or as opposed, let's say, to a Buddhist sense, a Buddhist philosophical sense or something. But I don't think there's an external transformation here. But you're quite right that it does depend on the context and community, doesn't it? Because certainly by the 2nd century of the Common Era, maybe even before, we definitely see Daoist communities thinking of external transformation, of gods that do things for us and so forth. And I don't know exactly how that arises, how that shift arises. Maybe others among us do and could share. But I think in these early practices and in the sense of contemplative practice, I think there's not an external like savior here. And so that's why I'm kind of trying to move aside the soteriological idea to the therapeutic idea. Now, on the matter of death, I do think that even back into the Zhuangzi, the process of contemplative practice, the consciousness that gets sort of transformed there can verbalize the experience as dying to something in the past. Something in the past is left. Now, by the time you get to, remember I had that like last poem about from Wang Chongyong. By the time you get to the 12th century, his speaking of himself as the living dead man. I mean, Wang actually dug a cave himself and called it a grave. And, you know, the hagiographies of Wang describe him as living a life of debauchery and so forth. So in an almost traditional kind of redemptive story that he lived this wild life and had to be reborn from it, had to be kind of saved from it. Not that the Tao saved him, but he does speak of dying to that life. And but I think more in general, apart from someone like Wang, the story is that one dies to the constructions that one has made that are counter-therapeutic, that tend to tie us in knots and such. I don't know, Ryan, I feel maybe I didn't do that well in responding, but I wonder if you have further thought, if any of that triggered thoughts for you.
No, those are great thoughts. One thing this randomly triggers is it just makes me think of the late Neo-Confucian Wang Yangming and his experience of kind of in his coffin, you might say, of enlightenment kind of experience that kind of triggered his later thinking. But I don't think that's related. Maybe it is, but I don't think so.
Well, we got a couple of experts on Wang Yangming with us this afternoon, PJ and David Chai. You know, both know a great deal about Wang Yangming. You know, Wang has, those of you maybe who don't know Wang Yangming, Wang has a notion, liangjie, the notion of liangjie, which is a kind of knowledge. And as I was working on this presentation, as I've been working on this presentation, this keeps coming up in my mind, whether Wang was trying to find a way to talk about a sort of knowledge, to talk about what the gain in the contemplative experience, still in some sort of epistemological sense, still in some sort of knowledge sense. But I just feel that it's the transformation and not a cognition that's gained in this experience.
Thank you, Ron. Thank you, Ronnie. We have Dennis.
Hi, Ronnie. Good to see you.
Hi, Dennis. Good to see you.
My question, or it's more of a thought, is actually exactly what you just finished with about knowledge. So I agree, if we think of knowledge as something kind of propositional, knowledge that, as people say, there is a problem with this kind of notion of mystical knowledge, and it also doesn't seem very wuwei if that's what's leading to action. But what if we think of knowledge as more as knowledge how, in that kind of dichotomy, which I think works better with wuwei, which I've never understood. I mean, yes, it's lack of self-consciousness or deliberateness, but it's not mindless. And if we think of cooking, for example, it does sometimes seem to entail some kind of expertise. So then the question is there some kind of transformational experience that leads to knowledge how? And since Wang Yangming came up, I also was thinking about the unity of knowledge and action in Wang Yangming.
It's a great point, because Wang recognizes a long time before I did, and in ways much more sophisticated than I. He's recognizing this problem of the will is still there, because knowing how to perform something or how to do something is still, still have the problem of the will to do it. And so this is why with Lineages, with this notion, he's trying to put knowledge and action together. I think what he's doing is he's pointing to the problem more than solving the problem for us. I don't, what do you think, Dennis?
Well, I was thinking, so Wang Yang has example that recognize the odor as foul is to dislike it. So it's not like a two-step process. First you smell it, then you dislike it. It's just all at once. So I think we definitely want that kind of unity. That whatever sitting in caves and doing these things does, it just, when it's finished, it manifests as just an ability to go into the world and act in a transformed way. So yeah, I mean, I think you're right to want to insist on that as not a two-step process. At first you have some kind of knowledge and then you go out and you practice it. So therapy might also be a kind of an interesting way to think about it. And at least some models of therapy is you reach some realization and then your agoraphobia disappears, or your inability to navigate social occasions disappears. So I'm trying to think of a sort of mundane example of a transformative experience that leads to some kind of new skill. I think if I come up with one, I'll let you know.
Thank you.
Ruth, please go ahead.
Yes, not to take up all the time, but if I may comment on Ryan and Dennis and Ronnie, the three of them. Ryan started with this question of death. What is it that dies? The common credo is to die before you die. And what it is that dies, I think, is the person that we take ourselves to be. Because we come to realize that we are not that person that has consciousness, but that we are consciousness. And this is something completely different. I don't mean consciousness depending on the brain or being an aspect of the mind or being a mental phenomena, but to be consciousness, to be that capacity to be conscious of other things. So what dies at that moment is the belief in being the human being, in the person. That person is what creates all this trouble, because that person grows old and will get ill and will die. And we have to make sure that he's not too cold and that he's fat and that he blood circulates and that he breathes. And you know, that person is the problem thing for us. Once we lose the identification with the person, we are free. We realize that we are consciousness. And that then, coming back to Dennis, is I think the only true knowledge, absolute knowledge we can have. That is that I am consciousness. I can only speak for myself in the end, perhaps. So I'm taking the solipsistic point of saying I am consciousness, and all else is object to me. So this, when I see that, when I realize that I'm consciousness, then I notice that this person is not so much doing, is not acting, but is being done. This person, the human being, consists of genes, is conditioned in a certain way, finds itself in certain circumstances. And those things determine what this human being will do. It's not free to choose, it's being done by whatever the whole thing that's going on. And that to realize that is that it's not a problem. This person is doing, is harmonious. It's either sitting here or it's not sitting here, but it can never be a conflict. The only conflict, the only problems we have are thinking problems. If we think that it should be different than it is, then we have a problem. When we realize that what is exactly what has to be, what ought to be, what is necessary, then we are free. So, just a comment.
Thank you, Ruth. Yeah, an interesting comment. And Rooney, the connection to the conversation so far, this idea of contemplative practice and how it leads to consciousness, as it were, or a perfected person, whichever concept we would want to go with. It seems it happens solitarily, you know. It happens within the subject, and I was just thinking how much of Daoism talks about intersubjective consciousness, where we depend on others and have and attain that transformation or perfection through relationships. How much of a relationality in terms of this intersubjective consciousness is part of the it's part of the contemplative practice. I'm asking as someone who is quite ignorant about Daoism, but I would really like to hear your thoughts on that, particularly because of the perspective I'm coming from, which is the African philosophical perspective, and a lot of emphasis on relationality and intersubjectivity. Any thoughts, Ronnie, on that?
You've got your finger right on the major difference between Confucianism and Daoism, right? Because in Confucianism, interrelationality is so important. We're created by each other and we create each other. And five categories of relation or more. But certainly we don't only need each other, but it's in that our delight comes, our solving of the quandaries of existence and of our life together come through the messiness of our life together. And whereas we've definitely been seeing in the discussion of contemplative practice today, we've been seeing a kind of move in another direction, more toward isolation. But now what I wonder is this not perhaps a natural outcome of what it means to practice contemplation? When we contemplate, when we practice mindfulness, can this be done together? Can we sort of cross consciousnesses, I suppose, as Woods has continued to remind us today? And I'm not sure that it can. It could be that the nature of the practice itself is isolating, moves towards isolation rather than toward community. I would love to hear others comment on that.
Yeah, and something quite related to that, thinking of community now more inclusively beyond human community, but to include non-human community, the environment, our very world in which we find ourselves. It seems that while there's not a lot of connection with the other human, there seems to be a lot of connection with the other non-human, with caves, with mountains, with the wind, with air. And I was just thinking in terms of course, our contemporary experiences and climate change, climate crisis, and how much of a theoretical framework from Daoism can help repair relationships with the environment.
Yeah, what I'm intrigued by there, Elvis, is your mention of non-human animals and so forth, because I think looking at how animals are portrayed, how they're talked about, how they're engaged with in Daoism is very interesting. And in a way, if you take the view in Daoism, like behold the animal or look at the animal, they're really kind of seen as the animal doesn't have the clutter of the mind that we do. The animal's mind is more simple. So the animal is living with the puzzle, the paradigm, doesn't problematize its existence as it is. So it's almost moving more towards Ziran, as Ryan was talking about, or maybe even wuwei. Do animals wuwei? I mean, I think you could make an argument for an affirmative answer on that in terms of Daoism. But so, you know, you see this is very, very much in contrast, I suppose, to, so if you think of the way, I was just teaching this a few weeks ago, Nietzsche begins that little work on the advantages and disadvantages of history. Nietzsche begins the work talking about, consider the cow, consider the cattle, look out on this field, you know, and you're looking at the cow or the cattle. And, but Nietzsche doesn't idealize them. He doesn't look to move toward that kind of simplicity. Cows, cattle, non-human animals, they have no notion of history. They, you know, they don't employ their reason and so forth. So his view is very, very different. He doesn't see, or maybe doesn't feel that kind of simplicity that you would see, that a Taoist would see. So Elvis, that's just a few random thoughts about human, non-human world. Elders may have much better thoughts than mine.
Yeah, I mean, it's very good. I mean, it's something worth exploring, definitely. Thank you so much, Ronnie. I think we've had very interesting conversations in the last roughly 50 minutes, based on a 40 minutes lecture, and I'm sure it will go on and on and on if we wanted to. There is a lot of interest you have sort of raised with your lecture, Ronnie, and many of us will be looking at the lecture again. And for all those who registered for the lecture, we'll send the YouTube link once it's ready in the next few days, so you can view it again and be able to reflect a bit more, contemplate a bit more, as contemplation is never rushed per se. Any last questions or comments before we draw the curtain? Anyone?
May I just say, Elvis, I would like to express my appreciation to everyone who came today for your interest. Please send suggestions, improvements. I welcome them, and thank you for those of you who asked questions. Thank you for your questions. They were insightful and very stimulating. So appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you, Ronnie. We are very pleased to have had you today, and we've enjoyed the lecture, definitely. We've enjoyed all the questions and comments, and it's been an opportunity to also meet new colleagues who I'm sure I'll be writing to and asking more questions based on their questions and comments as well. So thank you all for coming, for enjoying the 8th lecture with us. We're looking forward to the 9th lecture in June, and hopefully we'll be having a talk on Arabic philosophy or so, and the next one in August. So we'll keep looking at some philosophical traditions of the world. There are very many, and hopefully you'll be able to join us again. So thank you all for coming, and do enjoy a lovely weekend.
Thank you.